Hello, everyone, and welcome to another LCI Green Room live stream. I'm Jacob Winograd. I'm the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, which is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, part of our Christians for Liberty network. I'm excited tonight to be joined by Kerry Baldwin, which you guys should all be very familiar with. Kerry, how are you doing?
I'm good, Jacob. How are you?
I'm fantastic. So we've been planning this conversation for a while. We got a lot to talk about tonight. I don't want to get too bogged down with introductions since people should be relatively familiar with you, but go ahead and just give a brief reintroduction for those who maybe are finding you for the first time.
Sure. So again, my name is Kerry Baldwin. I am the proprietor of the website mereliberty.com. And my mission there is to challenge and rethink prevailing paradigms. What I'm best known for is my libertarian view on abortion, or a pro-life libertarian view on abortion specifically. And I also teach classes in critical thinking using the Socratic method.
Yep, and I've had Carrie on my show many times. Actually, I think the last episode we did, we did two back to back, one on the Socratic method, and then what was the other one? Oh, the other one was on
the modesty debate.
Yeah, the modesty debate, which I've actually recirculated that recently because that this keeps being brought back up.
That's right.
So
it'll happen again and again.
Yeah, it will, unfortunately. So tonight we're going to be talking about kind of a lot of different things, but all relating to the idea of self-ownership. So some of this is going to be kind of like reviewing Libertarianism 101, but then we're talking about some kind of important areas where sort of like issues that we as Christians care about overlap with the considerations that come from the libertarian idea of self-ownership, and where people might have questions or concerns about how this interacts, especially when it comes to parents and their children. So we're going to get into that a little bit later in the stream. This has actually been, again, we don't plan these things ahead, but like this live stream ended up happening after a live stream I did yesterday on someone else's show, where I was debating for 3 hours and was being pressed hard on self-ownership. So this is actually good to kind of like recap it and talk about it, because it is the foundation, I think, of libertarian legal theory. So we need to understand what it is. Let's start with that, just defining what the concept of self-ownership is and what implications there are, just immediately apparent of it.
Yeah, so the libertarian principle of self-ownership is fairly simple. It's the idea that you have the highest claim on your body than anybody else. Now, this is fairly obvious, I think, to non-Christians. For Christians, what comes up immediately is, well, doesn't God own us? And yes, we acknowledge that God owns us. I'm going to actually read from our Reformed Libertarians statement on, on self-ownership and property rights, just so that everybody can hear how we define that on Reformed Libertarians. So it reads, all humans are created by God, and so he is every person's owner. God in Christ is the creator and owner of all things. Reference Colossians 1:15-17. At the same time, having created humans in his image, God has given each person a stewardship over themselves and their property. In relation to other humans, we call each person's stewardship their self-ownership. And this self-ownership can be extended to acquisition of ownership in scarce resources. Ownership is the right to exclusive control, use, or disposal of a resource. We call this property rights. In one's person and things, and we cross-reference Exodus 21:16, Matthew 20:15, and Acts 5:4. And so this is the basis for one's civil and political right. So just sort of briefly, how we as human beings, as individuals, relate to God is different from how we relate to each other. And that's one major distinction for Christians to realize when they're conceptualizing self-ownership. We shouldn't confuse God's ownership of us as a negation of our self-ownership in relation to others. And I'll just say one more thing to that point. I've seen many non-libertarian Christians reject self-ownership as if this is some sort of license to be selfish or greedy or licentious, or that, those sorts of things. But that simply just fails to address the actual concept.
Yeah, so I think that's a good summary of self ownership. And I agree. Even the guy I was debating last night, agreed that yeah, self owner, like if you're going to be libertarian, self ownership and the non aggression principle, those are sort of the foundations of it. So going from that, we can start getting into you sort of already handled with some of the questions Christians might have, like, well, can we own ourselves if we belong to God, and what is the implications there? Another question that might be worth talking about is in terms of like what are possible like, are there limitations to this ownership? And then are we all equal at all points of our life in our ability to exercise, self-ownership, and, especially as it's pertaining to kids, right? Because if the idea is if you
Right.
own yourself and therefore you have the right to do with your body as you please, well, then I think maybe the first immediate or one of the first things that'll come to mind is, well, then, like, what about children? Do they own themselves? And if we're saying no, is that a potential contradiction in the term or the theory itself? Rothbard had a way of trying to handle this, which is one of the few instances where I think Rothbard got it really wrong. I don't know if you want to summarize Rothbard's view. From what I can remember, it's kind of essentially almost like parents don't have any obligations towards their offspring and could just, shouldn't like actively uh, initiate violence against them, but it can essentially neglect them to the point of letting them starve and die, or at least be, you know, in a state of perpetual neglect and
Right.
malnourishment and stuff. So,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, just briefly, as far as that's concerned, what Rothbard was trying to avoid was this idea that the state could create positive rights. And I think he's right about that, but I think the reasons why he's right have nothing to do with this thing with children. So I'll come back to that in a second. But to answer the first question about limitations, self-ownership entails the natural limitations that are commensurate with being human. Um, I make the argument with pregnancy that a woman has a right to choose not to become pregnant until she's pregnant. Then she's naturally limited, right? She has a baby growing in her. She no longer has that choice to not become pregnant. She already is. So she's naturally limited by that. For children, this also involves their human development. So both Rothbard and Hoppe tried to make this argument that children were only potential self-owners or they weren't full self-owners. And both of them had some sort of, arbitrary, oh, well, for Rothbard, it was if when the child is capable of running away from his parents, that's when he has full self-ownership. And Hoppe's argument was, well, when the child is capable of saying no, well, that's when they have, because that's their first, like, according to them, acts of agency. And so now they have full self-ownership. So I actually disagree with both of them on this, and argue that self-ownership is established from the moment conception is complete. So we are full self-owners, but the ability to exercise the rights associated with that are naturally limited based on human development. So obviously there's a natural limitation to a fetus, to an infant, to a toddler, to a child, to an adolescent. But also over time, what they're doing is they are developing the capacity for what Mises called human action. So I would say you are a self-owner from the moment conception is complete, but you are developing the capacity for human action, which once you've fully developed it into an adult, then you have that. We can dive into more if you want on that, but I'll pause there for a second.
Right. No. So I wonder if an apt comparison or analogy, like let's say uh, something unfortunate happens, like your parents pass away and their life insurance policy, pays out a certain amount of money. Well, you might be the
The,
payee in that case,
the
but if you're like,
beneficiary.
yeah, the beneficiary, but if you're 3 years old, you wouldn't be immediately just given that money, like a blank check or a stack of bills to use. The money would be put into some kind of trust
Right.
that there'd be a trustee who would be like the steward of that to hold and manage till you became of the age that you could actually inherit and own it. But you would still, in a legal sense, be the owner of that initial sum, so to
Right.
speak.
Yeah, the child is the owner of that inheritance, but they are not developmentally capable of exercising their rights concerning it, and so there's a trustee who's put in place, and the trustee their job specifically is to act in the interest of the child. So
Right, and, like, the trustee, because like, ownership would imply the ability to control and to exclude, and the trustee doesn't have ownership rights. They can't trade away
right,
the inheritance or the payout or anything. They're
yeah,
very limited in what they can do, in a legal sense. So I think
right,
it's uh, a good comparison as far as that goes. 'Cause I know some libertarians who try to square this come with they get into weird stuff like, uh, you know, children are self-owners, therefore, like, and this is tough because, like, I kind of believe in somewhat of uh I don't like the term gentle parenting or peaceful parenting because there's a lot of
right.
people that use those terms, and well, but a lot of libertarians will do this. They're like, it's like, oh, they're self-owners. So like, you're asking your 2-year-old, can I change your diaper, please? And asking,
Well,
like,
yeah. So this is interesting because we're talking about limitations. Limitations, interestingly enough, I would say are not quite they're not determined by parents, but they are assessed by parents, right? So let's take this diaper changing analogy for a minute. Um, Parents are in the best position to assess whether their child has developed the ability to have some agency, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, a parent can assess that an infant is incapable of cleaning its own butt after pooping in a diaper, right? So
right,
the parents have a responsibility with also a corresponding right to be the ones to do this. They can hire some sort of caretaker, but they are responsible for finding a good caretaker. Um, but they have a responsibility to change the infant's diaper and clean his bottom. They may, like I said, entrust this to a caretaker, but then they're responsible for finding somebody who's a quality caretaker and isn't going to violate the child's rights, which would be horrendous in this case. But once the child is potty trained, for example, the child takes control of that. And barring extenuating circumstances like some sort of health compromise, it would actually be inappropriate for the parent to be doing doing this task for an older and capable child. So we can actually see how the development of a child moves, and changes over time, and how that affects their agency and their ability to do things for themselves, and when that becomes inappropriate for the parents to do.
yeah, that makes sense. Uh, to go to the other extreme, example that might be a question that comes to mind. I So we're saying that parents do have a responsibility towards their children. You've made the argument for why this doesn't create uh, positive rights, which is what Rothbard and other libertarians are concerned about. But then, like, is there a legal responsibility that can be enforced by a libertarian legal theory if there's not a positive right or obligation? Like, what would that look like? Like, so can, in a libertarian sense, can some agency of law be used to prosecute parents who uh, do harmful things to their children? I mean, I think most everyone would agree that if you actually like physically harm your child, that would be prosecutable. What if it? I mean, are there? And this can be tough, right? Because uh, I know horror stories about parents who have struggled with uh, being falsely reported by CPS and things like that for things that
Hmm.
didn't happen, including in my time in the Libertarian Party by other supposed libertarians. I had a friend of mine who, just because she like voted one way, had these vengeful people call CPS on her, which was just awful. And so like we don't want that, but at the same time, if we're going to say that Rothbard's one wrong in that parents do have obligations to take care of their children that are natural, is there a point where the law can or should be uh, utilized to enforce this?
Yeah. So um, one of the differences between Rothbard and I is that I argue that natural obligations are created on the parents as a consequence of their action in creating a new human, a new self-owner, right? So none of us, first of all, this is one of the problems with this whole conversation is that everybody wants to analogize it, right? Everybody wants to, make it like Block, for example, makes it analogous to a landlord-tenant relationship, and I've got plenty of um, content explaining why that analogy doesn't work, but fundamentally it doesn't work because every human being comes into existence this way. So it's actually something that's normative, and we should be deducing normativity from it rather than trying to analogize it. So every single human being comes into existence because a man and a woman came together and had sexual relations, right? So that means that none of us have a choice to come into existence. Um, Even if our parents planned, expected, and wanted to produce children, we ourselves did not have the choice to come into existence. So, since this is also normative, it naturally entails a claim or proprietary interest in the parents by the offspring to provide for that child until they're developmentally capable of providing for themselves. Now, as far as specifics like what's enforceable by civil governance, I would say that that is food and shelter, which is evidenced by the placenta and umbilical cord and what those do, which is provide food and shelter, and also to some degree self-defense by way of just the womb, right? The fact that a baby is developing inside the mother's body is a matter of protection. But also, you know, having self-ownership means I have the right to self-defense, right? And if a fetus has self-ownership, they have the right to self-defense, but they don't have the developmental capacity to exercise self-defense, which means that the parents are on the hook for providing for that. Now, they can provide for it themselves, or they can find a suitable alternative, which, the obvious uh, thing with that is adoption. But things that don't really fall under that, I wouldn't say are enforceable by civil governance. For example, I mean, you need to provide food, but exactly what kind of food is much more arbitrary. Now, so what may fly under the banner of what's in the best interest of the child may be prudential, may be moral, may be ideal, but it's not necessarily coercively enforceable. So we have to, we have to start drawing those distinctions. The purpose of civil governance is only one thing, right? It's not to be the moral enforcer of the ideal, which is how we operate currently in our society, which is ironic because the enforcer of the ideal is like ruining children's lives right now. Um, so deciding what kind, what food to feed your child is not something the civil magistrate should determine. Now, say you live in this, anarchist society, a community may eventually come to the conclusion that feeding your child a high sugar diet is poisoning them and harming their development. And now that we have that knowledge, maybe that becomes something that's coercively enforceable. If somebody is doing that, that brings up the question of negligence. And I did some research on this and came across an article from Stephan Kinsella, who says that the idea of negligence as a legal aspect of libertarianism isn't really well developed. And I think he's probably right about that. But one of the things that he says is that when it comes to negligence comes in degrees. So if it's 100% negligence, or 100% intentional, then it's criminal, right? But let's say you have negligence that come in varying degrees from 10 to 90%. Well, then the legal response has to be proportional, whatever that is. And I imagine that negligence would have to come with some sort of consistency so that we're not punishing every single stupid little mistake that parents make, because that would be everything, right? Parents screw up all the time and make mistakes, and completely unintentionally. They're not trying to neglect their child. So we wouldn't want that to get wrapped up into that. So at any rate, the idea of negligence probably needs to be developed quite a bit. But unless you could prove, I would say, some intention to violate a child's rights, to starve them or poison them, or something to that effect with food, or by intentionally depriving them with food, unless they're doing something like that, then you wouldn't get the state wouldn't, or the civil magistrate wouldn't get involved with that. It may be something that your church gets involved with or your family gets involved with, but it would just be a nonviolent solution.
How to get over to the unmute button. Sorry, folks. I'm always clicking in the background. I don't want you guys to be distracted by that. So yeah, I think so. You brought up, and I agree with everything you said there. You brought up the proper role of civil governance, and we should touch on this a little bit. Part of why this conversation happened was we had someone send in an email asking us to talk about some of the reactions and commentary that was going on, I guess like a month or two back after Ron DeSantis signed the social media age verification bill, which basically says, like, I think it prevents most teenagers under the age of 16 from making social media accounts, and it bars all minors from any sexually explicit sites. This is obviously, a topic that's been waging in the culture war arena of politics for a while. DeSantis has been caught up in this a lot, whether it's controlling what public schools are allowed to have and teach, and what even private institutions can do, and now social media and stuff. These are issues that obviously a lot of Christians care about. A lot of conservative Christians are concerned that public institutions are being used by progressives to sort of push an ideological worldview and sort of like gender theory on children, and they worry, and then they would also worry about social media's role in that. But then, what is the proper response of that? And is civil governance something that we would say uh, is the correct tool for
Right.
this? Which I guess we've defined civil governance so many times, it might be useful to sort of like at least briefly redefine what we believe, as you and I are both reformed libertarians, so we have a distinctly reformed view in terms of how we define these things, which would explain sort of what our conclusions would be on then what's going on in the world today.
Right. So civil governance is specifically the administration of civil justice that is adjudicating those disputes that are a consequence of rights violations, specifically violations of the non-aggression principle. And I don't have that little section of our Reformed Libertarian statement in my notes, but you can go to reformedlibertarians.com, and we have a we have some statements about that and how we ground that in scripture. But when we want to know if something is within the proper role of governance, we must ask whether it's legitimate to use violence to enforce the proposed rule, right? So is it legitimate to use violence against parents and or tech companies and or website owners who fail to prevent children from gaining access to the internet or certain content on the internet? Is violence a solution to that problem? And I think arguably the answer is no. But another question we need to ask, and this is more specific to this bill that DeSantis signed, is it legitimate to threaten violence, to coerce internet companies into collecting specifically digital age verification information from minors and parents, which involves sending vital documents like birth certificates, state-issued IDs, et cetera, across the internet to tech companies chosen by the state? I seem to recall conservatives rebuffing such an idea of data collection when it came to vaccine passports. But suddenly this is okay in the name of protecting the children. I think we need to pause and ask some questions here. In order to answer the legitimate use of violence question from a libertarian perspective, we have to understand the libertarian principle of non-aggression. And while your libertarian listeners may feel like this is basic stuff, if they believe that the use of violence is legitimate in this case, then they may be erroneously interpreting the non-aggression principle through the lens of harm and not aggression. And I do have an article over at LCI explaining the difference and why defining crime by aggression is superior to defining it by harm.
Yeah, that's interesting. That actually, we were talking about if we would bring this up or not. This is actually a good part to bring this up because this was a huge part of the debate I was doing last night. This was on the Crucible with Andrew Wilson, and he kept pressing me, and this relates to self-ownership, that self-ownership cannot be commensurate with Christian principles because we have a duty to prevent people from harm. Kind of like what you were just alluding to, that like, well, if someone's going to sin, that's bad for their soul. And so, like, why wouldn't you use the civil magistrate, use whatever means are necessary to stop people from doing things that are, especially like certain sexual sins that would be defined as being like like almost self-harm. And you could draw a comparison to things that we would like, we would use probably not government force, but we might use some kind of like appropriate measure of force to stop someone who is attempting to end their own life, like grabbing pills out of their hand or grabbing them back away from a ledge or something. And he even said that's a violation of self-ownership, which to me that seems a little crazy. Which we can get into that, but then but he would push it past that, like past clear cases where someone's life is on the line. To well, no, but if just any time that there's harm, whether that's supposed physical harm or risk or even spiritual harm, that it's the Christian's duty to use force to stop that. But what you just said is sort of a rebuttal to that. That the use of civil governance is in pursuit of civil justice, which is pertaining to rights violations, which means when aggression is committed, not just any potential harm or externality that might come about from different decisions that people make.
Yeah, so aggression in libertarian theory is defined as initiating violence against another person or their property. So typically anything that falls under the category of self-harm is not considered a violation of the non-aggression principle. So, as far as some sort of law being in place to prevent self-harm, that wouldn't exist in a libertarian society. Now, I would say that, if my Christian friend is considering suicide, and I happen to be there when, he's, you know, taking that action, I can actually intervene, and it's not aggression because I'm not initiating violence against his person or property. I'm preventing him from harming himself. Um, I wouldn't call that a violation of his rights because I wouldn't say that he has a right to die. He certainly has a right to put things in his body that may harm him, but he doesn't have a right to die. And we actually know that because there are, people who attempt suicide who fail to achieve that. So,
Well, I
at
mean,
any rate,
I don't know if it's a reductio ad absurdum or not, but like if you had a because let's you either have a right to die or to attempt to end your life or you don't. If you do have that right, then you would almost create this weird perverse incentive that if someone attempted to off themselves and failed, you would be like obligated to like help them get back to the position of being able to do it again. Like, you know what I mean? I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
maybe that's wrong, but I mean, someone could at least make that case. I think like there's something there. Like if you have that right to if self ownership implies that right, um, I don't know. There could be some nebulous consequences of that.
well, as Christians, we believe that God determines when we die, right?
Right.
So, I would say this is one reason why some suicide attempts fail is because God has determined that that's going to fail. So, you may have a right to put anything you want into your body, even if it poisons you. That doesn't indicate that you have a right to die, right? So, at any rate, but as far as like Christian obligation, there is no legal obligation on the part of Christians to specifically intervene. Any obligations that we might have are moral obligations, but that's one of the things that you had mentioned were as one of the obligations that your interlocutor last night was saying that we have was over the eternal spiritual state of someone's soul. And I think that is egregiously wrong. We do not, as Christians, have the power to convict someone of their sin or save them from hell and damnation. That is the job of the Holy Spirit. And so asserting that Christians have that obligation, I would say, is a sin of unbelief. We don't have that obligation. We have a job to, uh, be there for our neighbor, to serve our neighbor, to serve our friends, to share the gospel, but we don't have an obligation over their eternal soul. And so I would vehemently disagree with his assessment of Christian theology.
Right, and he's an Eastern Orthodox, so of course that and I had to keep telling him, "Listen, we're not here to debate soteriology, so that's gonna have to wait for another day." 'Cause I know the Eastern Orthodox might have a completely different view than, not only just Reformed, but even different than, possibly Catholic and Protestant and a lot of Western Christianity. Uh,
Sure.
so but yeah, no, I think that that there's a lot of again, there's a lot of interplay and things that come up with this idea of self-ownership and but in terms of where it comes to civil governance, as we were just talking about and what the role is, yeah, I just think it comes down to having as you said, a sort of like flawed view of what the role of the civil magistrate is, and uh, ultimately, what it would seems to come down to with a lot of these people who would say that we have these obligations, um, or at least what often seems the case. I can't say universally, but what often seems the case is they still have a mistaken understanding of the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant law, and how that
Mhm.
does or does not apply in current day today. Uh, because they're like, well, if they were told to, you know, stone homosexuals in the old covenant, then why shouldn't we at the very least be stopping sodomy now because it's bad for them? It's sort of the the argument, and they would say, well, if they're self owners, then you go back into the old covenant, and when they were stopping people who were committing non-aggressive sins, is that commensurate with self ownership? But again, I think it's like, and I kept telling them, but you don't understand covenant theology, like it's
Well, I mean, yeah, there's that, but on the flip side of that coin, like even just from the standpoint of reality, like practical reality, laws, the purpose of civil law is not to stop people from doing bad things, right? We have laws against murder that hasn't stopped people from murdering. What those laws are for is to protect rights when they're violated. Like the assumption is rights are going to get violated, and so we need a system of adjudication when that happens. Laws are
right.
not designed to stop anything. So you may want to stop bestiality from happening, but writing a law is not going to do that. I
Well,
don't
Well,
like
and
that.
the other thing you kind of alluded to earlier is that it's the pursuit of justice, but even that, like, it's sort of an approximate justice in many cases. It's not going to be some kind of perfect final because I mean, first of all, how would you even define that? I think only God can achieve that anyway. But a lot of times for different rights violations, we're not talking about like, I mean, yeah, like the goal might be lofty to restore the victim to a position that what they were before the aggression happened, but that's you can't
So
like wipe the slate clean like it never
right,
happened in
yeah.
reality.
Well, we live in a society where people, I mean, we live in a society where the state is like this overarching entity over everything else, right? And so it's very easy to see it as the apex of the hierarchy. But we don't actually, in libertarianism, we don't believe that it has that position in society. Civil justice is one aspect of society, and civil governance is the administration related to that over here. But you have these other spheres of authority, family, church, business, and so on, where um, you know you have, if you have a problem that's nonviolent, meaning it's not the role of civil governance, it doesn't mean that we don't have a problem to solve. It just means that solving that problem means a nonviolent solution. It means not involving the state or the civil magistrate in that. And I think people get tripped up there. They think, oh, we've got this problem like bestiality, which isn't really a problem. But if we had that problem, it wouldn't be that we wouldn't deal with it as a culture, right? It doesn't mean it doesn't fall under one of those other spheres. And so we're just going to leave it alone because we don't want the government messing with it. It just means it's not the government's job, so we need to find a nonviolent solution to the problem. That's it. And I think the same thing goes when it comes to raising children. For example, there's a lot of things that would not fall under a rights violation, but maybe isn't the greatest idea. These debates between different forms of parenting would probably fall under nonviolent solutions. And that's a lot of, talking to each other and persuading one another and making a case for this or that based on, such and such evidence, which is what we do, even now. But there's this tendency to say, oh, well, we like peaceful parenting, and therefore, these parenting practices over here should be made illegal. Well, not necessarily. If they're a rights violation, maybe. If not, no, it means that we just need a nonviolent solution to that issue.
Right, and it's sort of this reminds me of just even just free market economics where, you're right, like, a lot of people because of just the way we've been raised, we kind of have this belief that the government is, um, this over or like, if we're looking at it through the lens of sphere sovereignty, which is what we do, people don't view these as distinct spheres. They're like, "Well, no, all these different things are just within the sphere of government, and it's just
Right.
this, and that's not how it works." And when you remove that in the same way that like when you remove uh state control and central planning from something and then when the free market takes over, it is able to generate solutions through the creative destruction of the market that you couldn't perhaps anticipate. There's a lot of problems I think in society that because we're only dealing with this sort of like almost like one dimensional like force or not force, and well, I guess we have to, if it's a problem we have to solve it with force. They're not thinking of the other solutions that are on the table for them to combat
Right.
that problem. And if they remove trying to use the wrong tool for the job from the equation, they'll start exploring other tools and maybe come up with because like even with idea that we've talked about abortion and how even today there are ways to reduce abortion without law, and there might be other innovations that come down the road that we haven't even thought of yet. And that's the beauty of like when you take force off the table, or at least relegate force to the narrow application that it has in society. Uh,
Mhm.
you then free up that mental space in the collective unit of people's minds, which is basically what the free market is. It's a machine that funnels that creative energy. You're able to better create a society that promotes human flourishing and that deals with the problems that you care about.
Right. Well, the point of the market is to solve human problems.
Right.
Um, the point of civil governance is to step in when violence is involved. That's it. It's not that the government is this this entity that attracts the best and the brightest and so should be in charge of all the innovations and blah blah blah. I mean, that's socialism. The point of the market is to solve problems, and we see this on a routine basis, especially when there's some sort of technological advancement. Suddenly we are faced with new questions and, okay, how do we solve this problem? I mean, AI is a perfect example of that. We're currently trying to work through um, conceptualizing how that's going to integrate into society in a just way, or even just a practical way, because it's going to, for example, replace certain jobs, not all jobs, but certain jobs. Um, and that just means that the market provides more solutions, right? We've seen this a million times. When there's an innovation in the market, yes, it may destroy some jobs, but it creates new jobs, or whatever the case is. So the point of the market, when it comes to things like parenting, or motherhood or fatherhood, those things are, that's the market is the place where we find most of those solutions, right? And the only time the state steps in is if violence is involved.
Yeah, no, I think that makes I think it's a sensible way of describing it. Um, to bring it back to the topic of self-ownership, um, so we had this law that was passed and by DeSantis, and I guess the question would be, um, with children, when the law should be able to intervene or not, I guess might be based on, if something happens that the child can or can't consent to, would be a major consideration of that. But that raises the question to bring it back to the dynamic of children, since they aren't full self owners and they have their parental involvement. What does it look like under a libertarian legal theory in terms of like what children can or cannot uh, consent to, and how like, and then who gets to decide that? Because like some people might be worried. Well, if like, I mean, on one hand, libertarians might say the state shouldn't define that, but then some people might be concerned, well, if parents define that, that might also be problematic. So what would be an answer to that concern?
So I would say consent is not a feature of self-ownership. Consent is a feature of human action. And children are developing the capacity for human action. And so their capacity to give consent is relevant, what's the word I'm looking for? Their capacity to give consent is incidental upon their developmental capabilities. So for example, children can give consent to sharing a toy, right? A young child is capable of understanding that sharing a toy with a friend means that that friend possesses that toy while he's playing with it, but that toy still belongs to her, right? She understands this. So she is capable of giving consent to sharing a toy. She can, she's capable of understanding that if she doesn't finish her supper one evening, that she's going to have to eat it for breakfast in the morning. So she can give consent to sharing a toy. She can give consent to eating her dinner or not. She understands, these her choices and consequences in that. So, but again, she's developing this capacity. This is actually one reason why parents parent this way, by giving their children choices and consequences and things like that, is to help the child develop this capacity to act. Now, she's not capable of giving consent where she's not, where she's underdeveloped. So she's not capable of being a party to or giving consent to a contract. She's not capable of giving consent sexually. She's not developed fully in that. Now, a 14-year-old, which this law targets children who are 13 and under, but there's like this gray area that they create for 14 and 15-year-olds. A 14-year-old is probably capable of understanding that if she sends her vital documents to a tech company to verify her age, that she's going to get access to, say, Snapchat. But providing that information doesn't mean that she understands the potential implications of sending data out into the ether, right? Not to mention that this age restriction is completely arbitrary, but her understanding of this is going to be completely dependent upon her parents explaining it to her ability to understand it. But the only people who are in the best position of assessing whether or not she can actually give consent in that situation are her parents, not the state. And so it doesn't even begin to make sense to have the state intervene in this.
Yeah, it is very similar to the answer you give on abortion, in terms of the mother is the person in the best position to protect the life of the child. And when we try to, I think the problem is always on so many things, and it's funny because like I always hate. I never want to like intentionally oversimplify things, but sometimes it just really is that simple. That
Yeah,
so much of the problem with statism is that people are trying to slay monsters that haven't even like presented themselves yet. They're trying to win wars before they're even waged, right? Like trying to prevent them or preemptively strike at them. And that's both like, I mean that in a literal sense, like our actual foreign policy is based on like, you know, interventionism and like preemptive strikes and stuff. But then even home, like on domestic issues, we're like, oh, you know, this could happen, so we need to let the state creep into our lives and start micromanaging everything we do so that no people could ever possibly do anything wrong. But
right,
the trade-offs of that, you know, like we talk about as libertarians, there's the seen and the unseen. Well, the the unseen but now very seen consequences of that are disastrous.
right.
And we wonder as conservatives why uh we have so little. I mean, I think parents were like really woke up during the COVID years to like how little control and influence they have in their kids' lives. It's like, well, you kind of you are reaping what you sowed. This
Right.
is the power that you uh, gleefully gave to the federal government in the name of all these different things that you were trying to prevent. And yeah, this is the price that we pay.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, listen, parents can get it wrong, but they're just an infinitely better position uh, to know what their child needs than the state is, and the state's gonna like, we know the state has bad intentions, and then the same problems with central planning, like, uh, you can almost compare it to economic calculation, right? Like, the government doesn't know your kid. It doesn't know the
Yeah.
same way as the government can't know like, if you have a centrally planned economy and you can't know the, enough of the factors and the prices of things to accurately gauge, like, how much to produce of something, which is the problem of central planned economies, that applies to children, right? Like, how can
Mhm.
the state be an accurate decider of what is right for children when if they're trying to centrally plan it, they don't have the information because they don't know your kids, and kids aren't
Right.
like they're not robots. Like, they're not like I'm a auto mechanic by trade, a transmission specialist. Like, yeah, listen, when Ford makes a transmission and they make a 10-speed automatic transmission now, well, every single one of those is kind of the same, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's not how kids aren't, like, produced in an assembly line, then they're all just the same, and we know exactly, uh, at this point, we need to teach it's like it's gonna like, I homeschool, and, uh, none of my kids have learned in the same way,
Mm.
right? Like, some of my
Right.
kids have learned to read right away, and others have had to take them a little bit longer. Some are really good at picking up math, and others, and it's like, r anyway, I don't wanna ramble on too long, but it's just to me, I see such a corollary between trying to preemptively solve problems before they happen and how central planning fails.
Right. Well, and we don't even need to attribute malice to the state. I mean, I could with this
Right.
bill from DeSantis. Like, this seems a little sus. But seriously, we don't even have to attribute malice to the state for these things. Hayek talks about the pretense of knowledge, this idea
Yep.
that the state has the sufficient knowledge to make these decisions better than parents is absurd. It's very easy to be like, oh, well, yeah, I think a 14 or 15-year-old might be able to make these decisions about whether or not they should be on Snapchat. But what if the 14 or 15-year-old has Down syndrome? Well, then they're not fit. But the only person who would know that is the parents. So, it doesn't even begin to make sense that it's the state who needs to make this. Now, I will say, um, that's not to say that tech companies or the market can't find better solutions for things like age verification, where maybe you are verifying your identity in a somewhat vulnerable way if that information was to, say, get hacked into. But that's the job of the market, is to find solutions to those problems, right? Improving parental control, internet parental controls would be one thing. But having the state decide that, X, Y, and Z companies are going to be in charge of receiving digital age verification from children and parents, and they're the arbiters of those standards, and no doubt will have access to that information. No, we don't want that. That's an intrusion. That is not within their role. We can solve the problem of what children run into on the internet through market means.
Yeah, what I'll add to that is that, um, so one of my favorite, things to say is that socialism makes people lazy. Right? Like, doesn't matter what aspect of the market or human society we're talking about.
Mhm.
Parents have, basically shipped off their children. I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them have shipped off their children to be raised by the state for generations. It's like I'm saying, like, but stop. You keep sending your kids to Caesar, wondering why they come out Romans.
Mhm.
And the yeah, in terms of the market solutions being so much better, I mean, the other thing is that I think, uh, when we rely on the state to sort of just be the, the first go-to to, like, solve these problems, um, then yeah, like I said earlier, we're preventing the free market from coming in and generating just better solutions,
Right.
uh, to these problems across the board. But people have this, like, weird, even today, like, as much as I sometimes think that, like, all right, like, we live in just such a, like, a weird world now that I just almost expect that the normies will see things the way I do, where I'm like, come on, like, you see the emperor doesn't have any clothes on, right? Like, you can't possibly still
Yeah.
trust the government. But, like, people are programmed to do that. Like, they'll one minute be complaining about taxation, be complaining about all this money going to foreign wars, and be complaining about election fraud that may or may not have happened. I'm not making a claim, YouTube. I'm just saying they complain about it. No flags on
Right.
my YouTube channel, please.
Yeah.
Gosh. Um, but it's like, but then I'll be like, oh, okay, so, like, why don't, you know, what do you think about DeSantis passing this bill? They're like, oh, that's fine. It's like, what are the unforeseen consequences of this? Like we're
Right.
just further giving the state another entryway to, and again, to reference sphere sovereignty. It's like the government is already subsumed so much of the sphere of the family. Like, how
Mhm.
much more do we want to give them?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, just as a reminder for our listeners, a little history lesson. It wasn't all that much long ago where single income families were a thing. But you can even go back further. I have an episode that I did with Nancy Piercy, who wrote this book called The Toxic War on Masculinity. And she points out that problems within the family didn't start with second wave feminism and women going to the workplace. It started with industrialization, which brought fathers out of the home for the first time in human history, where fathers didn't have a direct role in raising their children. So, a lot of the things that we're seeing
so
right now, is especially like from guys like your friend Andrew Wilson there, who is an obvious patriarchalist, who thinks, the solution to all
oh,
of
he's
our
a proud
problems,
patriarchalist.
yes, he thinks that the solution to all the problems is to get women out and put them back in the homes where they can raise the children. No, dude, the problem started when men were drawn out of the home, right? That's when their influence ended. That's when the boy crisis actually began. Now,
So funny you say that. My pastor made the same point in
yeah,
in his sermon this past Sunday, that, like, because he's like, people aren't going far enough back. They'd be like, it's all because of the sexual revolution of the 70s or this or that. He's like, a lot of this started with the Industrial Revolution.
it did. And we don't even, but Piercy, I want to just point this out. Piercy isn't even anti-capitalist. She's very much anti-socialism, but she's just pointing out that, actions have consequences. And this is actually a very Austrian economic sort of thing. Yes, the industrialization was great for certain things, but it also introduced new problems. This always happens with new technology. And so there's no reason in the world why we can't pause with what we're dealing with society. Turn off your mainstream media news channels, maybe even turn off the Crucible for a minute because that was highly charged. But sit and think about things for a second, right? We can embrace free market ideas and also accept the reality that it created new problems for us to solve, right? There's no reason why we
Yeah.
can't look at it that way. But also being realistic, a lot of the problems that we've run into have been from government intervention, right? Where families could provide for themselves fairly reasonably for a very long time in American history. Suddenly, in 2008, you have the housing crisis, and that literally pushed women to have to go out into the workplace and get a job, whether they wanted to or not, right? Then double income homes became a necessity. Well, what happens when double income homes become a necessity? Well, now you need more children's programs. Well, what's the state going to do? They're going to swoop in with all of these children's programs. And what's that going to do? That's going to influence, the raising of children in a way that parents don't want. So, it's important to realize that when libertarians are talking about reducing the power and influence of the state in society, it is for things like the sake of the family and cultural morality and things like that. The problems, we have enough problems that get introduced from new technologies and things like that. We don't need the state adding problems to it, especially in the name of keeping us safe or solving our problems for us.
Yeah, and in some ways, it's like so funny how nothing has changed, uh, from ancient history to today. Even though I mean, things have changed. I'm oversimplifying that statement, but you get what I mean. We just finished this in my church an entire series going from start to finish through the book of First Samuel. And so I was like, when we got to First Samuel 8, I was just sitting in my church chair, just like,
You're like, does anybody see it? Do you see it? Do you see it?
I was like nothing has changed. We're still looking to, whether it's a king or a politician or patriarchy or whatever it is, we're looking to everything but everything except the one person that we know that can actually save, which is Jesus Christ. But we're looking to all these things of the world to try to solve our problems. And it's so often it's government and it's power. But I think we've done a good job in this conversation of showcasing how that doesn't work. And in fact, just as God warned the Israelites that this king's gonna take your stuff, he's gonna enslave you, it's gonna be a real bad time. So we have today, the state's the big. I said this last night in my debate. Like if we care about Christian, Andrew's a Christian nationalist, and I've been talking to a lot of the Christian nationalists lately, and I keep on stressing to them, listen, if you want a Christian nation, listen, in the abstract, remove what their beliefs are. Yeah, of course I want to live in a nation filled with Christians. I want to see people saved. We're gonna have a much harder time doing that if we are empowering this giant state apparatus, which has done nothing but be absolutely subversive to the church and to the family, which are the bulwarks of the Christian ethos.
Right. Well, I would say, the Christian nationalists operate on this assumption that violence solves problems, and the state has conveniently monopolized violence. So therefore, Christians should just monopolize the state. And that is
we can use the ring against Sauron.
Right. It is based on the false premise that violence solves problems. It doesn't. Maybe you get to shut down something that is seen that you don't want to see, but it is going to create a new problem and quite frankly, an even bigger problem. So it doesn't solve problems.
Right. Well, we're running short on time here, and I want to get us going so we can. I had a late night last night, and I'm not going.
Yes, you did.
we're not doing another 3 hours here tonight. So, but Kerry, this has been great. I want to give you closing thoughts, just to kind of tie any loose ends that you think need to be buttoned up here at the end, and then of course also to plug your podcast, your work over there at Mere Liberty, and the things that you got going on.
Yeah, I think I think people reasonably have questions about self-ownership and its applications for certain things, because I think libertarians and libertarian thinkers have just sort of taken it as granted. I think it's an idea that needs to be developed out. It especially needs to be developed out, concerning children and parents and that relationship. That is really not, it's a very underdeveloped idea in libertarianism. And so that is where my particular research is focused on. So if you do want to support my endeavors in that, you can support me at mereliberty.com. You can subscribe, but there's also a monthly membership that you can sign up for. And I also teach courses in critical thinking using the Socratic method. I do not teach debate, but you can get information on that by going to libertyseminar.com. And I will be actually reopening registration for that very, very soon. And my students, I have adult students and high school students, and they have really loved it. One of my adult students said it's like going to the gym for your brain. So you can imagine that. At any rate, but yeah, I have a podcast called Dare to Think, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcatcher. And otherwise, you can find all the rest of my work at mereliberty.com.
Right. And I think Reformed Libertarians is coming out with new content again soon, right?
Oh, yes. I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Yeah. So the other podcast that I'm on is Reformed Libertarians podcast with Gregory Baus. We do have an episode we're going to be recording tomorrow about the kingdom of God and what that entails. That's been a conversation piece in the whole Christian nationalist debate situation. So we're going to be recording that tomorrow and should be coming out, I believe, in early June. But you can find that at reformedlibertarians.com. We've got a ton of content over there, a lot of theologically based arguments for why we're libertarian, and those are grounded in a confessionally reformed perspective.
Awesome. Yeah, everyone, please check out and support Kerry and her work. Kerry has been always very helpful to me. She was helpful to me when I was kind of going through my forming my Christian libertarian ideas. She's always willing to help me out, answer questions when I'm trying to including last night's debate, when I'm trying to make sure I'm forming my ideas and arguments correctly. So check out her work. Check out Reformed Libertarians as well with Greg. He's been immensely helpful to me as well. In terms of what I've got coming up, it is my 10-year wedding anniversary this Saturday. So you're going to see a little. Thank you. You're going to see a little bit of a drop off for like a week or so because I'm just not going to be producing content there. I'm going to have an episode that I believe will drop tomorrow where I'm going to do some clips and reactions to that debate I did last night on the Crucible with Andrew Wilson. And I'm going to be replaying that because right now it's behind a paywall on his channel, but he's let me publish it on mine as well. And I'm going to have that come out next week on my channel so you guys can watch the entire 3-hour slugfest that I went through. And if you're really willing to suffer through all 3 hours of that, which I think it's worth to do it in chunks. There's a lot of good stuff there. And then the only other thing I have scheduled right now in terms of live stream stuff that I'll let you guys know about to mark on your calendars. It hasn't been officially announced yet, but just keep in mind on June 6th, I believe. Yeah, June 6th, I will be doing a debate with Cody on pacifism. So that'll be interesting. So but that is all I have for you guys tonight. I appreciate you all tuning in and for your comments, and please make sure that if you before you hop off that you like this video and you subscribe to the channel or subscribe to the Twitter or Facebook wherever you're watching this, because that helps us out a lot. And that's all that I got for you guys. So we'll talk to you again next time. Make sure to live at peace and live for Christ.